You're listening to Love and Libido with me, your host, Dr. Emily Jamea. The goal of this podcast is to educate and inspire. My hope is that you will learn tools to create connection and cultivate passion, both within yourself and in your relationships. Here's what's coming up on today's episode.
Now, so much of the church is not silent, but aggressively, intentionally patriarchal and shame-filled. And that's how we control people's sexual lives, instill guilt and shame. And so my work is much more important now. So what happened was I got myself to a point of wellness and thought, you know what, there's a whole bunch of people on this journey behind me who are dealing with the same things or worse things. And so let me turn around and see what I can do to help. And so what I'm doing is I'm leaving breadcrumbs for the next generation to think critically about Christianity and what is culture and what's Christianity. That's a key question. My background is sociology as well as theology. So I put those two things together.
You bring you bring such an interesting perspective to this. I'm curious, despite the negative experience you had in your own church, what made you eventually join the church? And I know that you are obviously on a mission, on a crusade to bring sex positivity into it, but how has that been for you? What's the journey been like? Have people accepted you? What is it like for you today in the role that you have?
Well, mostly women, particularly 20s and 30s and 40-year-olds, are really wanting this message. So that tends to be my audience.
Yeah.
You fit into that, and perhaps your audience. But I knew when I was 11 years old, I wanted to be a minister. And I also knew that girls weren't allowed to do that. So I pretty much kept it a secret, trying to figure out, well, I think God told me to be a minister, but I don't know how to do it. And it wasn't until I was 30 that the women's movement said, it's okay to be a woman and it's okay to be a sexual woman. And then I thought, I'm going to go back to that, what I thought was the voice of God, go to seminary to decide whether or not I could stay in the church, because I knew I was called to the ministry. And I discovered all kinds of feminist research out there and theologians who were saying, no, what you got was patriarchal BS. And that's not in the stories of Jesus. So I come from a biblically oriented church denomination. And so I'm thinking that all of this stuff that we're getting that's negative about pleasure and women and the body it's about culture. It's not about Jesus. And I can give you some Bible verses and talk about that if you want to.
Yeah, I think I do. And I'm sure people would love to hear it, because I know that the narrative these days is a really far departure from what's written in the Bible. And maybe before we get into that, I think it could be kind of fun and interesting for you to cite a couple of things maybe that actually are written in the Bible that we would never even consider taking seriously today, because so much of this is about cherry picking, right?
Oh my goodness. Well, the one that I think people just simply overlook is that if your brother happens to die, then you have to have sex with his widow and make babies. That's your religious responsibility. It's the Levirate law, and it's in the same books that condemn homosexuality, supposedly, although the Bible doesn't say anything about orientation. But anyway, so not wearing blended fabrics is one of the Levitical codes. And of course, people wear polyester, cotton, that's not a problem at all. So we're very much cherry picking certain ones. And then the ones that we do cherry pick, if you look at the scholarship underneath it, you say, well, that's not what they were talking about. So the word abomination, for example, doesn't mean what we think it means. It simply means this is not something that good Israelites do. It's not naturally to us. This is not that's them over there. It's not, you're going to hell and burning to a crisp kind of thing.
Right. Which is where I think a lot of people go with this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to begin by talking a little bit about what actually is written in the Bible about sex and pleasure versus what is often taught today, especially through the very damaging purity movement that I believe began back in the 80s.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to understand that the Bible is very procreation oriented. One ethicist called it procreationist. And it's also not particularly interested in women. They're just kind of an accessory to make babies, boy babies. So we have that baby maker thing going, and then there's some traumatic things that happen sexually. Some of those stories with Tamar, for example, and rapes and so forth. And the biblical writers just kind of gloss over it like it's not a big deal. Well, it wasn't a big deal because the women were not particularly valued then. So, and neither in the Greco-Roman world, which is really where some of that purity stuff and the mind-body split will come out later. But that's where I start. The Bible has a lot to say about pleasure, and most of it's negative. And that's because if you look at it, the context of it, it's not talking about pleasure. It's not talking about sensual pleasure or sexual pleasure. It's talking about irresponsible hedonism. It's talking about forgetting you are a follower of your God and doing things for your own ego purposes or greed or whatever. So when the Bible talks about pleasure, it's mostly poorly translated. It should be irresponsible hedonism.
Yeah, because it sounds like people take it as like it's a very binary model. Either you abstain for pleasure or any pleasure is hedonistic, and that really is a poor interpretation, is what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's kind of where we start until we get to the Christian scriptures. And then when you get to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we read of a Jewish man who was a rule breaker. And he broke rules when it prevented relationships, when it prevented healing, and when they impeded physical needs. If you're hungry, you can violate that religious rule and go out there and get some grain in the field. If you're hungry, you don't have to go through the ritual purification of the hand washing. You can just eat because your body wants it. So the relationship and the healing stuff, that's good ethics, it seems to me, that he was not an anarchist. He was not out to build a new religion. He was a good Jew. He went to the synagogue, did the things that he was supposed to do, except when the religious rules impacted his relationships and his ability to connect with other people or heal people. So then what we have in the New Testament is we have a Jewish man who is critiquing his own religion and doing it in a way that says, you've forgotten the purpose of all these rules, which is to love. Love God, love yourself and your neighbor, with your mind, body, spirit. Love. That's what it's all about, right?
Right.
So what we have today in purity culture is people who are focused on vaginas and penises to a lesser extent, and hymens, and who's touching who and which gender and how many times and all that stuff. And excuse me, Jesus' critique is, what's that got to do with love, right? So I say that Jesus came along and the early followers got the message, and the early church got the message because there were women leadership. They were violating gender roles. You just look at the book of Corinthians, they were really having all kinds of sexual issues they had to deal with. So Jesus was a blip on the screen. There was a time period there where things were in turmoil and people were being liberated because of Jesus' teachings, that it's all about love. There's some deconstructing, if you will, of the religious rituals of the day, or religious teachings of the day, through that lens of what is loving. And that's a good ethical lens. And it makes people nervous, because what that means is what's loving for you to do may not be loving for me to do. And so it's not a one size fits all sexual ethic. So yeah, if you follow the rules, you got kind of a dichotomy. Here's right, here's wrong. We know exactly which lane we're in. It makes things simple, and it also hurts a lot of people. and creates a lot of problems.
If you liked this video, drop me a like and subscribe below. Share with a friend who might find it interesting. You can also listen to this in podcast form anywhere podcasts are streamed by searching for Love and Libido with Dr. Emily Jamea. Finally, follow me across all social media channels at Dr. Emily Jamea for daily emotional and physical intimacy tips.